This afternoon's discussion examines the relevance of reconstruction zones as viable vehicles for economic reconstruction in fragile areas. We all know that efforts to rebuild or strengthen economies of fragile and conflict-affected countries have had very mixed results in recent years. This is in spite of the billions of dollars that have been spent in this area. And one thing that we note is that even in areas where we see the green shoots of recovery beginning to appear, we know that most economies remain aid-dependent, poverty is endemic, the institutions remain anemic, and corruption is rife. And we really do need to do a better job if we are going to see sustainable and effective impact in these areas. In her September 2011 USIP report titled The Economics of Peace, our featured speaker, Graciana del Castillo, identified 5 rules for economic reconstruction and 2 priorities, namely equity and employment. Successfully following these rules and attaining these objectives has proven quite challenging in most cases. And this is partly because service delivery is generally inadequate, institutions are weak, and market failures are significant. In her subsequent paper, which is the focus of our discussion today, Graciana tried to address some of these challenges by proposing reconstruction zones as a viable alternative. Unlike the traditional approaches to ad hoc economic zones, she has an integrated approach that includes both local and export-oriented industrial zones. Today we are hoping that we'll have a discussion that would enable us to explore not just the viability of her proposal, but also how it applies to countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan. Our hope is that in subsequent meetings we'll be able to explore applicability in other parts of the world. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you back to USIP and Graciana. She's the author of Rebuilding War-Torn States and a former senior research scholar and adjunct professor in economics at Columbia University. She's also co-founding partner of the Macroeconomic Advisory Group. We have bios for all the presenters and the speakers, and so please feel free to pick one up if you want more detailed introductions. And as discussants, we are very pleased to have with us, joining us via Skype, Roger B. Myerson, who is the Glen A. Lloyd Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. And in 2007, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in recognition of his contributions to mechanism design theory. Thank you very much for joining us, Roger.
Thank you, Raymond.
And he will be he will be talking a bit about the Afghanistan perspective. And our second discussant, and again a pleasure to welcome you back to USIP, is Suja Nawaz. He's the first director of the South Asian Center of the Atlantic Council and former managing editor of Finance and Development, which is the World Bank and the IMF's joint quarterly. We welcome his insights on the Pakistan side of things. So what we would do is have a discussion among the presenter and the panelists, and then open the conversation to include you who are with us here in the room and those joining us via our live webcast. But before we start, I'll ask you kindly to turn off anything that rings, beeps, or sings, or vibrates, because it's really as a courtesy to our speakers, and also because it does impact the AV equipment in this room. And secondly, during the question and answer session, please use the microphone and identify yourself before making your contributions. And if you are joining us by live webcast, you could send your comments or questions via Twitter or email, and you have all the instructions on our website. And so I'll turn to you first, Graciana. This morning we got a question, two questions from the Brussels School of International Studies in Belgium, and they want to know whether you have any evidence that reconstruction zones will work where all other efforts have failed, and secondly, whether or not they could succeed without firm commitments and demonstrable support from national governments, and in this case, the governments of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so...
Definitely not. Definitely not. Nothing can work unless they have support from the national governments. Well, let me thank Raymond for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and to have Shoshana was my old colleague at the IMF as one of the discussants, and he knows so much about this area that it's really a privilege. Roger Myerson, who I really admire, and I think it's great that he has this blackboard full of formulas so economists can get the idea that, you know, even a Nobel laureate can worry about Afghanistan. Most economists think that this is a country it's not worth bothering about. I'm more pessimist today than I was 2 days ago after reading what has been going on in the camps in Kabul. So I'm sorry if I sound too negative, but I think it's important to have an idea of the background behind these reconstruction zones. I was in Afghanistan in the summer, and I came back after 2 weeks with the clear impression that the Afghan economy is built as a house of cards and that it's going to collapse as soon as the U.S. withdraws. And I think basically growth has been very fast. I mean, when I asked in a conference not too long ago, which is the country that has grown the fastest in the last 10 years, everybody said China, but in fact it has been Afghanistan. Of course, what does it mean to grow from such low levels? It doesn't mean much, but it has been growing at very rapid growth rates. So the issue is what will happen when the U.S. withdraws. And most of the growth has been coming from construction and from retail. I was invited at Ernst & Young conference in Kabul when I was there, and most of the private sector people that were in this conference, they were thinking already of leaving as as the international community leaves and the foreign troops leave. So this is something that we have to think about. What are we leaving behind? And I think it's going to collapse for many reasons. First of all, the IMF says that really the government has made incredible improvement in tax collection and tax revenue. It has increased from 5% in the first 5 years to 11%. I mean, you have to put this in context. That's what Mexico gets in tax revenue. So for Afghanistan, it's a big achievement. Now, the issue is, where is the tax revenue coming from? And most of it's coming from what I mentioned were the sources of growth, which was construction and retail, something that it's going to disappear in years to come. Now, if we look at, let me give you some of the facts, which I think are very important. On the one hand, you have a trade deficit or a current account deficits, they're very similar, amounting to something about it's balanced if you include grants, but if you exclude grants, it's something about 40% of GDP. So you can understand what this means. I mean, having a deficit of 5% of GDP is already a big problem, but having a deficit of 30 or 40% of GDP is a tragedy. Now, this is, on the one hand, you are importing food, you are importing all agricultural products. For instance, inflation last year, a large part of it had to do with increasing food imports, the increase in the prices of food imports. On the other hand, you have an economy that the operating expenditures are 15% of GDP, of which security is over half of that. Okay, so as the U.S. withdraws and as military aid falls, this is going to put a lot of pressure on the Afghan budget. Then, when you look at the development expenditures, you see that they are ridiculously low. For instance, education is only 0.7% of GDP, health 0.6%. So what's happening? What's happening is that most of the services are done and financed by NGOs and agencies, UN agencies. So what do people think? Well, people think, why do we need a government? And I'm sure Roger is going to say more about that. Why do we need a central government that doesn't provide any of the services, doesn't provide the security? Why do we need this government for? Okay. On the other hand, a country in which the large majority, 80%, live from the land, the government only invests 1.2% of GDP in the agriculture sector and rural development, falling from the previous year, which was 2.4%. So you think, what are they thinking of? How can they decrease investment in agriculture when they are importing all their food, for example? So this is one issue. The other issue has to do with external financing. If we look in the case of Afghanistan, donors finance both the budget through grants to the operating budget and to the developing budget. So you have the budget, the government budget has operating and development separated. But at the same time, you have what it's called external budget. This is something that many countries coming out of war have, because donors like to channel their aid outside the government budget, in part because then they can follow their own agenda, in part because they don't trust the government, and in part because the government is so inefficient that only 40% of the development budget is implemented. Okay, so there are many reasons for that. But if we look at the external budget, it's 42% of GDP at the present time, but the IMF projects it's going to fall to 30% in 2 or 3 years. So we have, on the one hand, budgetary support is like over 10% of GDP, and off-budget support is another 30%. So altogether is 42%, which is going to fall below 30% in 2 years. So we see the fantastic adjustment that this government will have to do. Okay, so let me just mention a little bit about the data. I live in New York, so I have all this, and I've worked at Wall Street, so I have all these friends from Wall Street, and they are telling me very concerned about the crisis and about the domestic situation in the U.S. and all that. So they said, oh, finally, we are getting out of Afghanistan. We have spent over $400 billion in Afghanistan. I said, no, we haven't spent $400 billion in Afghanistan. Most of it, we have spent it in the U.S., and this has been a stimulus to our own economy, not to Afghanistan. And in fact, when you look at the money that has been allocated to Afghanistan, military and non-military aid for the last 10 years has been about $52 billion. That's an awful lot of money. But over half of that, has gone into the military forces. So it's training the military and the police, and also getting equipment, a large part of it. And the rest is for economic and social expenditure, but it's done also through, U.S. contractors buying things in the U.S. and so forth. So, I mean, what gets into the country is much less than what the press reports. Okay, now, what are the other options? And for me, you know, when we look at what has been happening in the mining sector, I think, yes, it's true, Afghanistan has a large potential in mining, you know, but you know, we had some programs on the INAC mines that Raymond organized before, and we thought that this was going to start production in 2012, and we know they haven't even started. So, and we know that there is an enormous need for infrastructure to get these sectors going. Now, you know, they have allocated the rights for the iron ore mine at Hashigak in Bamiyan to an Indian companies and a Canadian company. But we know they need to, first they need to do a power plant, then they have to do the railroad to bring the production, and they have to invest in the mine themselves. So the investment is huge. And, you know, at a time when the U.S. is withdrawing the troops, the issue of security is going to become a big question, because if you are going to put all these billions of dollars into infrastructure, you are going to make sure that they don't blow up the infrastructure overnight. So, yes, mining has a lot of potential, but it's not going to happen in the near future. Furthermore, yesterday I finished my paper on Liberia Reconstruction Zones, and Liberia has signed 30 concessions since the government, since the transition to peace in 2003, and it has been estimated that those 30 concessions, once they start producing, it will take a lot of time for them to start producing, they will create something like 90,000 jobs in the next 10 years. But Liberia, which is a tiny country of less than 4 million people, will need 50,000 jobs a year just to include the new youth that is coming into the market. So we see that the mining sector is not going to produce the jobs that a country that has about 60-70% of their people below 30 years of age that they need. So definitely, I mean, I have no question that a lot needs to be done in rural development and in terms of food security. So that's where I start with. Now, why the reconstruction zones? And when I was there, I talked to a lot of people about how do they expect to move forward once this amount of aid falls. And one of the things they are thinking of is doing industrial parks, and the World Bank is working on that, and they have lots of projects. Now, there are many things related to the industrial parks. As I point out in this paper on reconstruction zones in Haiti, you know, these export processing zones, they can be very good because countries like Costa Rica and Ireland and everything, they have been using them very productively only because they have been able to link these zones to the domestic economy and create all kinds of links through the universities, through transfer of technology, through training suppliers and imposing international standards on providers and suppliers and so forth. So you can really do it through these zones, but you have to link them, which is not at all the case of what has happened in Haiti. In Haiti, these zones, as in other Latin American and Central American countries, they have functioned as enclaves, and we know the problems that enclaves had. Furthermore, these zones have had very low salaries, very bad working conditions, and they have been a source of problems and even human rights violations over the years. So when Collier says Haiti should become an export processing zone, the whole country should become an export processing zone, I would like him to read and see some of the problems that these zones have created in Haiti, not now, but over the last 30 years. Okay, so this is one thing that Afghanistan is doing. First of all, in these zones, there are mostly women that work. It's not clear whether this is going to happen in Afghanistan. Second, all these zones are related to the urban areas. And that's a problem, because what you want to do in Kabul, for instance, in Kabul, the city was built for 250,000 people. Now it has 5 million people. So you want to get the people out of the city, not into the city. So this is one thing. Now, obviously, Afghanistan needs to have a source of foreign exchange. Now, what could be the source of foreign exchange? Eventually, it could be mining, but that's not going to happen in the next 10 years. So they have to look. One of the things they've been planning to do is to have commercial agriculture for export. So that's how the export-oriented reconstruction zone would work in Afghanistan. And the local, what will be linked to it, would be an area where the government wants to restore the village life by linking this area through rural development around the villages. So it would consist of an area that would be export-oriented, and this rural development in the villages to produce for domestic consumption and food consumption. Now, why do I think about that? One of the first things when I was working with Jeffrey Sachs and Ishaq Nadiri on this project, which is called the New Kabul City, I went to the Google map and I saw this place that was mentioned in an article in the New York Times not too long ago, and it's called, what is it called? I forgot the name now. Alice Gun. So Alice Gun is a big project financed by the Australians, $10 million. And you go to the Google map, and it's amazing because there are like 1,500 houses, mud built and beautiful. You look at them and you don't see any people. So you say, well, maybe this was before people moved in. It was supposed to be for refugees. But there is nobody there. Why there is nobody there? Well, I mean, there's a clear explanation. There are no services and there are no jobs. So people moved there. They were coming from Iran, refugees from Iran and Pakistan. They moved there, and after a while they had to go back to the slums in Kabul because there wasn't. Now, is it possible? Is it possible for the government? The government wants to develop an area north of there for commercial agriculture. Are they going to be able to do it? My argument is, unless you bring foreign investors and you create these for exports only, you're not going to do it. The government doesn't have, it requires major infrastructure. You have the land, but you don't have the water. You have to bring it from the Panjshir Valley. It's very expensive to bring the water. You have wind. You have to create forests to protect from the wind. I mean, you have enormous infrastructure that you have to build before you can utilize this. Of course, there are infrastructure that it's there. The airport is there, so you could export easily from there and all that. So why would Japanese flower producers or Dutch flower producers come to produce there? And they are not going to unless the government gives them tax exemptions and unless they give them a stable framework. One of the things I learned from this Ernst & Young seminar is that in Afghanistan, companies not only need to get a permit to open up, that takes them through 6 different ministries and agencies, but also they have to renew the permit every year. So, who in their right minds are going to invest in a country where you don't know whether next year you are going to be able to operate? Nobody's going to do the infrastructure it requires. I mean, only people that they know they're going to make a fast buck are going to invest there. So I think that unless they do this, they are not going to develop that area. Now, what's the advantage of doing that? Well, first you have the people, you have the housing for people that work there to live there, and then you have next to it you have these villages where you can have the rural development, and then you will have interactions. You will sell the food there, and this is one way which I think could really reactivate production in the short run with very little investment in infrastructure, because you would be using infrastructure that it's there. And even the government has built 12,000 units in this new Kabul city, but people are not going to move there unless they have job opportunities. So this is one. Of course, this is only a beginning, and then you have to do this. One place where you are going to have to do it is when you start the mining projects. Like, for instance, in the INAC mines, I was there also, and you have to have a place where people will be living, where you can have food production for the people working in the mines and so forth. Unless you do that, you are going to create enclaves which are not going to live much. Remember that these investors are going to invest in the short run. Eventually, they're going to export, and the exports are going to stay largely abroad. So you need to create the links, and you need to use the investors to create links for transfer of technology, for training local suppliers, and so forth. So I don't want to say anything else because I think I've already. But basically, the idea is that we need these zones. First of all, it will pursue the interests of the government. I think the government needs to have rural development, and they say they want to do it. But most importantly, I think it will be a way of having an inclusive way of production. I think it's very important because only a very small elite has been benefiting from all the progress in Afghanistan. It would be a way of, first of all, helping women within the communities because they can't produce simply because they don't have the input. So